Good evening, persons of quality, and here's your lecture on Ode on a Grecian Urn. Got a lot of light behind me to my left, just making sure that we have enough detail here to make sure that we're clear. So the idea here is that Ode on a Grecian Urn is a significant poem by John Keats. It's often paired with Ode to a Nightingale. So ultimately, you should be responsible for Ode to a Nightingale, but this year, 2023, I'm going to pay attention to Ode to Psyche. So compare Ode on a Grecian Urn to Ode to Psyche so that you're certainly prepared for where we're going to end up for Tuesday's test. Now, it is currently Sunday, and I'm looking at my calendar. It is 3:16. I'm sorry, 3:26. So moving forward, we're certainly wrapping up our British Romanticism unit so that we can move further with the research paper and further with the transition to British Romanticism. So I'm going to go through my notes so that we're on the same page. So again, like I said, Ode on a Grecian Urn is often paired with Ode to a Nightingale. Both poems are ultimately about the fine arts. Now, I find this significant because British Romanticism, all about feelings and emotion and all of this, is in John Keats's poems taking an opportunity to look at how the fine arts, art, the appreciation of art, the appreciation of beauty, the appreciation of sculpture, for example, all ultimately matters. So I think that's very significant to our understanding of what's going on. So John Keats is writing a short, relatively short poem, an ode to, for example, a Grecian urn. Now, I posted on our website a picture of a Grecian urn. Now, for me, growing up studying Minoan culture and studying Greek pottery and art, for example, I have a real good understanding of what a Grecian urn looks like. It's a vase with a very particular active scene posted on it. So I find that very significant. So understand that the picture is a frozen moment in time. So as I go forward with my lesson, I talk very much about a poem on sculpture and how that works. It's a poem about fine arts and the observation of a larger scene, but reflective in what we see on that particular urn. So as I'm looking at my notes, many choices of subject. So in Keats's poem, there are three specific scenes, and those three scenes offer us significant detail about what we want to pay attention to. So many choices of subject, I think that's important. We talk about the visual arts, and as my notes say, they have no position in time. So these are frozen moments in time that we as readers need to specifically focus on and offer some analysis of as we go through it. So again, I think that's going to matter, that significant portion in time, because it offers us the idea that art and emotion can never fade. That they can never fade because they have an impression upon us as readers, as reflectors on the larger idea. So What my notes say specifically is that this is very similar to the Song of a Nightingale. Now, the reason why this is significant is because John Keats wrote a tremendous poem called Ode to a Nightingale. So that may be Monday night, Tuesday's particular reflection so that we can move forward and have an understanding of that. But again, there's this idea that beauty can never fade, very similarly to the Song of a Nightingale. So you get a lot going on here. This may be a different type of flipped lesson compared to the other lessons that I've done because I'm offering you very specific feedback and opportunities to reflect on John Keats' poem. Now, we also speak about the idea or theme of the mortality of human life. The idea that time is very significantly passing, and that because it's passing, we as human beings become very, very concerned about our own worth, our own sort of legacy in the world. So this is very much about the term is temporality, the temporariness of life. So again, as you're taking notes, this might be a significant idea for you to write down as an idea. So because this poem and Ode to a Nightingale are very much about the visual arts. And again, you want to write this down for Ode on a Grecian Urn. This is very much what the visual arts have no position in time. Because they have no position in time, they can never fade. So a piece of art that's on an urn compared to, for example, the fleeting emotion of a summer's day, or the fleeting ideas of William Blake and William Wordsworth. I think ultimately what we're talking about here is that these ideas are bigger. They're more significant concepts. So as a result, they can never fade. Very similar, like the Song of a Nightingale. The concepts can't fade. That we hear the music and it makes an impression upon our soul, and therefore we can move forward. As I'm looking at my notes, I go back to this idea of our own human mortality and how we address that as a larger concept and what we're going to do with it. If we know that we're going to die, if we know that we're temporary, what do we do with beauty? Now, given what I'm going to ask you to do with this lecture to develop as larger ideas, I think this is significant to you. Power pause. So, second sort of presentation here is that John Keats chooses an urn because it is round. Now, round may seem relatively simplistic, but it's very much this circle idea we talked about in September, maybe even into October, that because it is round, it forms a full circle, so time repeats. Very much tying our idea of the Grecian urn to this concept of time and how we are forever, if you want to think about the idea that we are forever stuck in this time loop where we repeat the same actions over and over again, it gives us a sense of the eternal. Gives us a sense of the eternal. Now, I spent a lot of time today in preparation for this lesson talking about, or at least listening to the presentation of Helen Vendler. She's a professor, and she was certainly offering these ideas. She's a professor at Harvard University, and she's offering us the concept of the eternal and how that's going to matter. So she talks about the ode on a Grecian urn as escape from the temporality, the idea of time, that is escape from this specific and singular moment in time and why that matters. She says very specifically that the flat presentation of the urn, we look at pictures and we have to do some sort of analysis about how those pictures function. She says that very specifically it has a circular motto as well, that even though it is flat, it encompasses an entire story. So that circular idea, very much what we've been talking about, is birth to death. There's a connection between the starting point and very dramatically to the ending point. Now, if you're watching the screen, it's very circular in its presentation. So I think that's important. It gives us very much a sense of the eternal. What does that exactly mean? The eternal is an escape from the world in which we live. So that we look at art and we say that there's a presentation here in looking at art on the Grecian urn, and that somehow transcends our understanding to something bigger. Now, I understand this is relatively fluffy and pulls on our very much our sensuous nuance, but I think that absolutely matters. So again, that flat urn, the pictures on the urn has a central motto as well. And this is very much the idea that it says at the end of the poem, that truth is beauty and that beauty is truth. And then again, the idea that truth is beauty. So there's very much a circular, very round. You start at one place and you end up at absolutely another. Truth is beauty and beauty is truth. What exactly in your mindset does that mean? Think about that for a second while you are taking notes on your ode on a Grecian urn. Now I'm pausing here for the sake of taking a drink of coffee, which at 6:47 is not completely irrational for me. And of course, perhaps a bonus point will be involved in what that cup of coffee says on the glass. So again, Keats chooses an urn because it is round. It forms a full circle, so time repeats. Again, from this poem, have an awareness of how time functions. It gives us a sense of the eternal, as Helen Vendler from Harvard University suggests. It is an escape from temporality. The urn has a circular motto as well. Truth is beauty, beauty is truth. So perhaps a little redundant, but again, I think it really helps us to get towards a larger theme. Moving further in this, by choosing an urn, and I think really the choice of an urn is significant. The urn connects several scenes in the particular poem. For example, it talks about or somehow relates to a real Hellenic. Hellenic refers to the Greek idea. It's a Hellenic urn. A Hellenic urn, like you're looking at, would have these larger ideas, but it would not have group scenes. So the poem that Keats talks about, where we're moving through three specific scenes in the poem, I find that incredibly significant because the real urn wouldn't have those scenes, but Keats draws us through three particular ideas. Clearly, no such real urn exists. I look at this and I say this is very much an example of the secondary imagination and how we take this concept and we extrapolate it. We take it further so it makes more sense. So a real urn would not have grouped scenes where we see three particular ideas in the poem. That then tells me that this is a poetic interpretation of the ideas. So, for example, a real urn wouldn't have grouped scenes, so there would be no lovers paired with, and again, I'm looking at my notes, no lovers would be in pursuit of a religious theme. Either your urn is going to be religiously themed in purpose or it's going to be very secular. It's not really going to address the two ideas. Now, for me, I've got 4 pages of notes, and I just transitioned onto page number 3. So, if I look further at the urn itself and what Keats is trying to do, the fiction of the poem has come from somewhere. Sorry, I dropped my sheet. Comes from somewhere. So, what is the fiction of the poem? What is actually going on in the text that makes sense? Now, considering primary and secondary imagination, this very much talks about this idea of the aesthetic. And again, if you need a definition of the aesthetic, look back at what Coleridge was trying to do with religious and the aesthetic ideas contained in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. If you need to look up a definition of the aesthetic, the appreciation of art and how that works, I think that matters. I would go on further and I would address the idea that the poem, Ode on a Grecian Urn, could have a funeral function. It could be a larger hymn that celebrates the growth and the value of the individual. So I think these are very specific ideas. Now, ultimately, Keats can tie this very specifically to Ode to Psyche, which is another poem by him. Psyche is Physche, and then Ode to a Nightingale, which is very much the study of art and how it functions in poetry. So it's the appreciation very much of a statue, of a piece of art, or something very eclectic in its presentation. Now, ultimately, because I have an art background, this makes a tremendous amount of sense to me as I'm on page 3 and I'm progressing through my notes. And I'm here at 18 minutes. So, this address to the Grecian urn is Keats places himself in the role of spectator. Now, if you look at the actual text, if the urn has a true father, here we're talking about the sculptor. That sculptor is dead. So very much that art form and the creativity has gone aside. And so the art stands for itself. Secondarily, if it has a mother, we're going to call that mother Posey, P-O-S-E-Y. Posey is very much the inspiration that comes with artistic pursuit. As I'm looking here at my notes, it talks about the inspiration is gone from the poet, although I want you to be able to argue whether or not that inspiration is in fact gone. So if all of that is true, if these arguments about the father of the poem, the sculptor is dead, and that the mother Posey inspiration is gone, what does that mean? That means to me, it means that the meaning has been preserved in the aesthetic. Aesthetic is Aesthetic. Very much elevating your understanding here. The meaning has been preserved in the aesthetic. The spectacular is connected to its origin. Now, I want you to ponder that and think about it for just a little bit. And again, looking at the camera, this is what it says. The spectacular has its origin in art. Now, what does that mean? If you think about the imagery in the poem, there's the very specific description of the bride. It is a bride of silence. It is a bride who has been fostered in the deep delved earth and preserved from decay. So what does it mean that the bride, frozen in time, has been fostered in the deep delved earth and preserved from decay? Think about that as a larger idea. I'm sure I'm going to assess you on it. Tuesday is your larger exam on this. So I want you to think about how this works. I often look at fancy names and why they matter. So, for example, we talk about the still unravished. Make sure I can read my notes here. The still unravished bride of quietuseness. The still unravished bride of quietuseness. And also talks about the idea of the sylvan wood and very specifically the sylvan historian. So what is Keats attempting to do by talking about the unravished bride of quietuseness and the sylvan ideas? Now, that means that you're going to have to do some analysis, some reflection on what this unravished bride. Remember, it's frozen in time, so I think that's going to largely matter. Think about this idea of the sylvan wood, the forest, and why that's ultimately going to matter. This is very different from the ideas that we've looked at before. Keats is very interested in tying the concept of the urn here at roughly 23 minutes to larger concepts and ideas. So in the next 6 or so minutes, I'm going to try and wrap this up. So I think very much in this intellectual presentation of our ideas, this is about giving the aesthetic shape. Creating this idea of fair attitude and this concept of the cold pastoral. Now, look up what pastoral means in your notes so you have a larger idea so you can tie ultimately all of this together. I'm going to offer that Keats enters the art as a sympathetic observer. So this is very much like an ode to a nightingale, looking at a piece of art and finding emotion, finding a larger concept in its ideas. So if we're talking about how John Keats enters art as a sympathetic observer, he forgets himself as he enters the emotion of the scene. We don't care so much about the medium. We look now instead at the impression that observing art is going to give us. My notes say that because we forget the medium, we don't think about the art, and instead we elevate this to a much larger concept. So, as we move into this, Keats finds empathy. Now, figure out how you're going to define that Keats finds empathy. Then, once you have that Keats finds empathy, think about how Keats then separates that empathy from what we feel, how we see the art. We come to a larger idea because of our perception. What's the separation between our own meaning and the larger concept? I think that matters. Keats sees how the mind acts, first in empathy, then in contemplative action and speculation. I'm going to say that again. Now, I realize I'm at the 25-minute mark, so we're certainly dragging ourselves through this. But Keats finds empathy, then separation. Keats finds empathy, then separation. We feel, then we see the art, then we come to a larger idea. Perception, art itself, and then, for the sake of my hands, then we have an understanding of the inspiration. Keats sees how the acts, first in empathy, then in contemplation and speculation. So there's this Jesuit idea about contemplatives in action. Things we did very much before the pandemic, but this idea of contemplatives. We sit and we reflect on the larger meaning. So if this is true, think here about your contemplatives in action. Exercises that connect us to the larger themes in the poem. So given the images, given the ideas that Keats ode on a Grecian urn, this idea of being frozen in time, how that all functions. Because we know that the ode is full of questions. We know that the ode is full of questions. We reject the dull brain that retards us from understanding what's going on. We reject the dull brain that retards us from understanding what's going on here at the 27:30 mark. The ode is full of questions. So from my perspective, how has the mind awoken or awakened from darkness? What does it see? In the second or third movement of the poem, how do we address this idea? How is the poem a vision of a waking dream? Now, for me, and I'm prepped. I got 4 pages of notes. How does that ultimately work? How does Keats offer a question to the urn? Who are they? What is it that we're capturing in time? What does it offer us as a larger idea? So I think the very fact that Keats questions the urn is going to be significant. Now here's the analysis I'm going to offer you. Keats's reflection acts as a naive speculation. He asks, what are they doing? What are they doing? What are they seeking? What is the story they're trying to tell us? So I think ultimately, looking at Ode on a Grecian Urn, we've got a lot of storytelling we have to do. There's a lot of analysis we have to do at the 29-minute mark here. Late in the poem, Keats asks the urn for an answer it cannot give. He asks for an answer from an analysis that it cannot give. There is no legend. There is no key to understanding the map, hence the term legend. There is no key to understanding the larger idea of the poem. And to use the language of Keats, there is only a border of leaves. So As a reader, all of you persons of quality, what is the larger idea that Keats is trying to get at in his poem, Ode on a Grecian Urn? Now I'm at the 30-minute mark. Given the fact this is taking an entire class period, this makes entire sense. Clearly, Keats and those people on the urn have origins. They are directed by their type of clothes. They are indicated by their specific presentation. So I think all of that is going to matter. But Keats offers us allegorical questions. Keats's questions all go unanswered. So very specifically, what are some of those questions that Keats offers us that are unresolved or undeveloped in the course of the poem? So my notes, Keats' questions all go unanswered. Where do we see this specifically in the poem? Where does it happen? Provide examples so it makes sense. How does the urn tie to this larger understanding of what's going on? Because as I wrote down here on this page, the urn does not offer us its legends. And of course, a legend is a way to interpret a map. So the urn itself, now think of this as a piece of pottery. The piece of pottery does not offer us a larger understanding. It does not yield up its legends. Instead, it is an artistic or aesthetic presentation of a larger idea. And I think very much that's what we're doing with this understanding of Ode on a Grecian Urn. Keats is looking at a piece of pottery and the fact that the piece of pottery often has scenes of rural or pastoral life. Might be worth writing down. It has scenes of rural or pastoral life. This is certainly going to be of value, I think, to our understanding. That these romantics look at the pastoral or what happens in nature's simple shepherds and simple ideas. And they tie this larger idea to romantic themes. How are you going to tie the pastoral to very much romantic themes? Now, I've given you 4 pages of notes. And to be a bit more dramatic, these are the 4 pages of notes that I think are valuable, or that I think of value. Now, plan that on Tuesday nights or Wednesday night, I'm going to give you a whole lesson on Ode to a Nightingale. So we can wrap up our understanding in advance of Tuesday's test of how John Keats works as an author. So takeaways and deliverables at this 33 3/4 mark minute is to make sure you have an understanding of Ode on a Grecian Urn, its major images, and how it gets to the idea of theme. If you can do that, I think you're ultimately going to be in good shape. And when I return from retreat, you're going to have an opportunity to reflect on these ideas. All right, my persons of quality, you have a wonderful evening, and I'll see you on the flip side.